All right, very good. So our last section of instruction was about isometric drawing, and that's where we left off. Isometric drawing is a pictorial method that gives you decent realism without too much difficulty. We saw how to set up shapes using 30-degree angles to create isometric drawings, and I would invite you to do a little experimenting. Can you sketch these things out using isometric projection? So I'm providing you with a top view, front view, and a side view. Can you make some simple, quick isometric sketches on some graph paper? Now you might say, well, how do you sketch isometric drawings on graph paper? And the answer is there's special graph paper for that. So if you go to the internet and you go to print free graph paper, printfreegraphpaper.com is a website where you can print out all kinds of crazy graph paper. Here's the square graph that we're used to, Cartesian graph, but if we click on there and go down, we see isometric graph is one of the options. And I usually pick the 1/4 inch isometric graph. Then when you hit print, it produces a PDF sheet for you with that snazzy isometric graph, and you can print this out, and then you've got some 30-degree lines to work with. As long as you hold the paper long ways up and down, portrait style, the angle will be correct. If you turn it sideways, well, then you got problems. Okay, so keep the paper just like this for using the paper from this website. Okay, but if you have some paper, you'd be able to go through and make some isometric sketches. We saw no matter how hard the shape, it can be broken down one step at a time and progressively developing finished shapes, subtracting or taking away or chipping away at the big block until we've got what's left over that we want. We saw that lines that do not fall in the isometric axes are called non-isometric lines. So here on the first block, all the lines are isometric lines. But here, when we locate where that vertex is at the bottom of the valley, this line and this line do not follow the isometric axes, so they will not be true length lines when you go to measure them. And then of course circles turn into ellipses, and depending on what face you are drawing on, the ellipse might be pointed up to the left, up to the right, or pointed left to right. Right, but we saw how to take an ellipse and turn it into a cylinder or a hole. Right here we've got a half pipe cut out, made out of a couple of ellipses. Now, we're not going to ever work with irregular curves in isometric, so we don't have to worry about that, but you could plot out each point and then create the curve in isometric if you had to. Why is isometric such a big deal? Well, really locally, chances of you having to draw some mechanical object in isometric, I mean, I guess it's okay, but the real use for isometric is in the piping industry. Process piping requires isometric drawings out the wazoo, which means we have to be able to represent complex 3D arrangements in an easily understood way, and isometric is that agreed upon format. So here we have some fittings and pipe, and we have some vessels, and everything is connected, and it's quite easy to imagine what we're looking at. If we were trying to draw things in traditional engineering views with a top view and a front view, man, it becomes very hard to figure out what the heck is going on when we look at the symbols and we're trying to visualize how all this stuff works. So generally, isometric is a lot easier to understand. You see, this is the same system we were just looking at, but in isometric. Hard to visualize from the top and front, much easier to see everything in 3D space when we're looking at it from an isometric perspective. Here's a plumbing plan, same idea. All of the plumbing is laid out in isometric projection. And then isometric dimensions, well, you'd have to tweak your dimensions to get them to look isometric, and we'll talk about that. So here are some isometric exercises. Like I said, if you print out some graph paper and want to give it a go, you can pause and work your way through and see if you can sketch these out one at a time until you've got some good looking isometric sketches. Now over in AutoCAD, we'll take a look at a bunch of things I've set up for you here. First, I've got three objects. I've drawn them in isometric. I've got a cube, and I got a sphere, and I got a cylinder. And they look 3D, even though we know they're not. They're just flat 2D drawings. So one of the things we can do to dress up an isometric is we can add a little bit of hatch to it. And right, these are the gradient hatches. So a gradient hatch allows you to throw in two colors that ramp to each other, one to the other. And with that gradient, you're able to go in there and set up things so they look like they have highlight and shadow, even though it's just a flat drawing. Over here, I've done the same thing with this figure here. Right, I've taken this object and I've thrown a little bit of shade and a little bit of highlight inside the hole using the gradients. Okay, so that's one way to dress up an isometric. Here's another one, by making the outline a heavy line. Right, so not every line, but the line that defines the outline of the profile for the whole shape. So we'll see this on isometric pictorial drawings too. When it's time to show a corner that's round, you got a couple of options. One option is just this. I mean, there's no line right there. It's round, right? So it is a smooth blend. We wouldn't want to draw extra lines because they're not necessary. So I don't need a line here. And I don't need a line here. I mean, yeah, those are the points of tangency. So even though these lines represent where the flat plane turns into a curved plane, they're not going to be used or needed. Actually, they look kind of goofy. So one possibility is going in there, and I've made an array, a path array of fillets going up across here. And it's not with the fillet command either. I should mention that to you. You're not going to get a fillet which is set up for a 90-degree corner to work if we're doing isometric. Right, so fillet, oh, let's see. Here to here, right? That does this on a square corner, but it's not going to do that in isometric. It's going to make a mess. That is not the fillet we want. How do you make a fillet in isometric? Well, quite simply, you need to create an ellipse. So let's say we did 0.75 and 0.75 and then 0.75 for a 3/4 fillet, right? And then I would go to my isoplane and set it up for the front plane. Isoplane left. And then my axis and ellipse. Isometric circle. Click and click. So that is a fillet in isometric. What would a fillet look like if we were to do it with the fillet tool? I'll show you the difference. So here's what we want. Right, here's what we would want. Here's the flat line, here's the curve, and then there's the flat edge again. If we just use the fillet tool and we set up that 0.75 distance, you went from here to here. See what you're getting? You're getting a totally goofy and useless sort of thing. So we'll do a trim, get rid of what we don't need, and that's how we set up a fillet in isometric.